Hello, my name is Chris Pruitt, and I'm an Assemblies of God Children's Ministries Director for the state of Minnesota. And through my studies in trying to be intentional of how we can raise up this next generation for Jesus, and by the way, it's easier to raise up a generation than it is to reach a generation. That's why kids ministry is so important. But anyway, just studying how we can do that effectively. And through a master's program at North Central University, for my capstone project, I'm focusing on how we can build emotionally healthy kids in our Assemblies of God churches. So why emotional health is critical is, well, we learned that Jesus, he grew in 4 quadrants. So many kids, pastors, and leaders quote Luke 2:52, which is Jesus grew in wisdom and stature, in favor with God and man. So Jesus was growing intellectually, in that intellectual box. He was growing in the physical box, which is pretty cool. He was growing in the spiritual box and also the relational box. But one box that we often don't talk about enough in the church is the emotional box, which affects every other one of those boxes. And what I love about Jesus, we learn in Hebrews that he was our high priest that suffered, that went through everything that we went through so we can relate to him. Every emotion that we face, Jesus has gone through. But oftentimes we don't talk about emotions as often in the church, and it's a vital component to growth. Emotions are a kind of radar and rapid response system, constructing and carrying meaning across the flow of experience. There are so many things coming against kids from developing emotionally today. We're coming off a pandemic. What's it going to look like for years down the road when schools have been shut down, when kids have missed opportunities with classmates, with sports? Through years down the road, what is this going to look like? The effects of a pandemic, the effects of parents maybe losing a job through financial crisis. And a lot of times we don't see kids the emotional side of them. Kids are very good at masking emotions because sometimes they can be the silent mourners. They could have a tragedy in their life, but we see them on a Sunday morning and they're bouncing off the walls, they're smiling. But you know what? There's kind of a weight. Kids can be carrying a weight, kind of like an invisible backpack of heavy emotions, challenging emotions that they are facing and processing. There's so many threats to emotional health. And one of them, let me set this down. So kids, they carry an invisible backpack, and some of the heavy emotions that they may be carrying are frustration. I did a survey, a nationwide survey, and they said the third biggest emotion that they see kids struggling with in their kids' churches are frustration, fear, and the last one could be anger. There's so much that weighs down our kids from being able to develop emotionally. And a lot of times, even threats such as pandemics, health, social distancing, all those things, but there could be also an increased amount of screen time. There was a study, a huge study from 1991 all the way to 2016, and they found something pretty crazy that happened in 2012. The study said since 2012, adolescents score lower in self-esteem, life satisfaction, and happiness than ever before. They discovered that more time spent on electronic communication and screens lowered the students' psychological well-being scores. So, as kids, pastors, and leaders, we need to remember that every kid is wearing an invisible backpack. And there are weights, challenging emotions that might weigh them down, that might make every single area of their life, every one of these quadrants, the psychological, the intellectual quadrant, the physical quadrant, the spiritual quadrant, and the relational quadrant, our emotions can make those more challenging unless we deal with them in a healthy, godly way. There are a lot of challenges and threats to the emotional health of kids. And through my studies, the biggest threat that I found are something called the ACEs. Now, the ACEs stand for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And so I want you to think of a little tiny ant when we think about these things. The ant stands for abuse, then neglect, and then trouble in the home. So think of ant as we process these ACEs, and it's a way for us to remember these 10 ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, that dramatically affect the emotional health of kids. The letter A stands for abuse. There's physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. The N stands for neglect. Kids that have been physically neglected or emotionally neglected. And T stands for trouble in the home. That could be mental illness in the home, an incarcerated relative or family member, a mother that has been treated violently, substance abuse, or divorce. So here's some stats on the troubling effect of ACEs. 38% of children nationwide have experienced one or more adverse childhood experiences. So adverse childhood experiences not only affect the mental health capacities of kids, but also their physical health. Those with ACE scores of 4 or more had significantly higher rates of heart disease and diabetes than those with ACE scores of 0. The likelihood of chronic pulmonary lung disease increased 390%, hepatitis 240%, depression 460%, suicide 1,220%. Those with an ACE score of 6 had a 4,600% increase in the likelihood of becoming an IV drug user. As I continue to study the ACEs, my heart began to break for these kids that have experienced trauma, because there is a cumulative effect when ACEs stack, when traumas stack. Kids who have 4 or more adverse childhood experiences in their life, they are 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. Children that have had 6 or more ACEs in their life, it takes 20 years off their life expectancy. So what I'm saying, when Jesus told that parable of the good shepherd leaving the 99 to find that one lost sheep, I believe kids in our ministries that have gone through multiple traumas could be like that one sheep. Trauma has pulled them away from the flock. There are so many threats to them growing emotionally healthy that we need to figure out how we can pour more resources and give them more attention in their time of need so that they can heal from that trauma. And so we know with healing from trauma, there'll always be scars, but what we want to do as kids, pastors, and leaders is to make sure that those traumas don't infect other areas of their life. That infection doesn't spread. We want the Holy Spirit to be able to help them heal from each and every one of those traumas. So what can we do? As kids, pastors, and leaders, we should have our counselors on speed dial, healthy people that can pour into our kids that are professionals. We should also be willing to spend some one-on-one time with some kids who need extra attention. We should meet with parents. We should also set reminders on your phone to check in with these kids. Oftentimes, kids that have gone through multiple traumas, their family might be broken, and those might be the kids that will not be regular attenders at church. So we need to make sure that we're going after those kids. Ask them how they're doing today. Celebrate progress with them and advocate for them. So right now, we realize that there is a huge threat towards emotional health, and that is adverse childhood experiences. So I want you as a children's pastor or leader, or maybe a small group watching this, or if you're in church leadership at all, I want you to pause this right now, and I'm going to ask you 2 questions that I want you to process what this looks like in your ministry context. The first question is this: what is your plan to help kids who are recovering from a traumatic event such as a divorce? Do you have a plan in place? Or are we just trying to give kids hugs when they go through tough stuff and we just wish them the best? What's our plan? Are we being intentional with hurting and suffering kids? Because once again, oftentimes our kids are the silent mourners. They might not display it, but they are carrying this invisible backpack of heaviness. We need to be intentional with kids in trauma. Second question is this: how do you find out if a child has gone through more than one adverse childhood experience? We need to find out ways to kind of gauge the threat level. Once again, trauma stacks, and the more negative experiences that a kid has walked through, the more their emotional health is compromised. So we need to be intentional and help them to heal from those individual traumas instead of letting trauma stack to the point that it threatens them so severely. So in this training, we talked about how we can build emotionally healthy kids in our Assemblies of God churches. We talked about the threats. The biggest threat to kids developing emotional health in our church is adverse childhood experiences. And right now, I'm going to take a page out of the schools book. Teachers all throughout this nation right now are realizing that to teach good academics, you just can't stay in the academic box. You also need to teach students social skills and emotional skills so that they can be better academics. And it started back in the 1960s. There was a Yale medicine study, and James Comer went to one of the most difficult parts of the nation. He went to New Haven, Connecticut. The schools, the attendance was so low, grades were so bad, off the charts bad, and he started to develop something called social emotional learning. And social emotional learning is really diving into the students' lives, getting to understand their social, their awareness, helping them develop emotional awareness, helping them develop emotional regulation skills. And instead of just approaching problems as opportunities to correct behavior, social emotional learning addresses problems and how to help kids navigate those challenging emotions. It's really a relational base to help correct and develop these kids, not just laying down the law, not just giving more consequences, but really trying to seek to understand these students. And once these students felt understood and known, their attendance, their grades, so many things started to flourish because of the social emotional learning approach. SEL, or social emotional learning, is a way to teach the soft skills that have been correlated with conflict resolution and character building. SEL used to be a wishy-washy skill, but has now developed into an essential part of education. SEL really started to take off in the early 90s. There was a conference of educators, and these guys got together. Daniel Goleman was one of the guys there, and he's the emotional intelligence guru. He wrote the book Emotional Intelligence, which has taken off, which also makes the claim that IQ is important, but EQ, our emotional quotient, is just as, if not more important than our IQ in developing skills, retaining jobs, and just having overall life satisfaction. The group that was formed was called CASEL. It stands for Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. CASEL focuses on 5 core competencies. The first is self-awareness. The second is self-management. The third is social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. So right now there's over 22 million teachers across this country in the U.S. that are teaching social emotional learning skills as a core to developing kids academically. And actually they're trying to develop kids holistically. So my argument is this: in the church, we can't stay in the spiritual box. We also need to help kids develop socially and emotionally. If Jesus says all of Scripture, all the commandments are basically summed up as this: love God and love people, we need to teach kids how to love people as well, because that is a critical component to being spiritual, to being whole. And so here's how we can do that at the church. We need to teach kids self-awareness, how to process what emotions that they're going through. Words have power. Being able to name an emotion is critically important. And another thing is self-regulation. One thing that we could help kids, maybe just a practical technique, is a breathing technique. And one is called bubble breathing. And it's just helping children to get control, to slow down so they can process more clearly. Bubble breathing, you can touch your knuckles. You can say, I'm going to make a bubble that's this big. And then the second knuckle is, I'm going to make a bubble that fills my body. Third bubble, you can make a bubble that fills the room. And the fourth bubble, you can make a bubble that fills the whole building. And when kids can do bubble breathing, it can help slow their heart rate. Another type of breathing exercise is called box breathing. Some military techniques also teach this. Some militaries also teach box breathing. You breathe in for 4 seconds. You hold it for 4 seconds. And then you exhale for 4 seconds. And then you pause for 4 seconds. Just doing box breathing 2 times can help lower your heart rate significantly. And it can help kids just gain control a little bit of their emotions instead of being so reactionary. So as kids, pastors, and leaders, we must be willing to give parents and also to equip ourselves with some practical ways to help kids slow down, to regain control so that we can process in a godly way. And the second thing I would love to see churches be more intentional with is teaching about the emotions on a Sunday morning. Not just covering the Bible event. Like, for instance, on one Sunday morning, we might cover the story of Joseph. We might say he was betrayed by his siblings, and then he was sold into slavery, and while he was in slavery, he was falsely accused by Potiphar's wife, and then he was wrongfully imprisoned for an unjust amount of time, but God redeemed him, and all of a sudden he was second in command of all of Egypt, and he saved a whole bunch of people. That's a lot of information to cover in one Sunday. What if we would get more intentional talking about the emotional side of our Bible heroes? Because oftentimes when we don't talk about the emotions, we just make them to be heroes of the faith, people that were so far above us. But in James, he advocates that Elijah, he was just a man like us. We need to teach kids that these Bible heroes, they didn't have the end story. They had to trust God like Joseph. To ask these kids, have you ever felt betrayed by a family member? Have you ever felt that maybe a parent was showing favoritism? What did Joseph do in those situations? What did he do when he was falsely accused? What did he do when he was sitting in prison for years? He was still faithful to God. He still trusted God. Even with all these challenging emotions, things that weren't fair, he still trusted God. Talk about the emotional side of our Bible heroes. Not just the big facts and the big data points, but talk about those characters and how they trusted God even with their emotions. To build resilient kids, we need to take a tough, tell it as it is approach to building emotional health in children. And quite possibly the biggest reason and why we need to focus on the emotional health of kids is because Peter Scazzero says this. He says it's impossible for a person to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. If kids can't regulate themselves, if they don't have awareness to love others, how are they supposed to love God? Because loving God and loving others is supposed to be this beautiful dance. It's supposed to be at the same time always. And so if we're not teaching kids how to love themselves and how to love others, we are missing out on a critical component of growth. And so to build emotionally healthy kids across the assemblies of God, not only do we need to teach kids the spiritual, awesome things of God, but we need to teach them how to grow emotionally as well. So thank you so much for your time. And I have two parting questions that I want to leave for you guys as you process how to develop emotionally healthy kids in your kids' ministry. Here's the questions. How are you intentionally trying to build emotionally healthy children as well as spiritually healthy children? And the second question is this. What are some practical techniques you can teach kids and parents to identify and regulate their emotions? Well, thank you so much for tuning into this video. My prayer is that as the church, pastors, leaders, anybody watching this video, that we would be more intentional to raise these kids, not only spiritually, but emotionally as well, so this next generation could know their God and change the world for His name's sake. Thank you so much for watching.